Sarah Martinez adjusted her camera equipment one more time, checking the battery levels on her recording device. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site where she stood, preparing for what seemed like another routine interview. As a freelance media worker for Channel 7 News, she had covered hundreds of stories just like this one. Today's assignment was simple enough: document the progress on the new metro shopping complex that promised to bring jobs and commerce to the downtown district. The project manager, a heavyset man named Robert Chen, walked toward her with a clipboard tucked under his arm. Behind him, the massive steel framework of the future shopping center rose into the sky like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. Workers in hard hats moved about the site with practiced efficiency, their voices mixing with the steady rhythm of machinery and the occasional bang of metal on metal. "Ms. Martinez, thank you for coming out today," Robert said, extending his hand. "We're really excited to show the community what we're building here. This complex will house over 50 retail spaces, a food court, and a multiplex cinema. We're looking at creating nearly 800 jobs when everything is complete." Sarah nodded, lifting her camera to frame the shot. Through her viewfinder, she watched workers high above them welding joints on the third floor. Sparks flew in brilliant orange arcs, disappearing into the morning air. She had always found construction sites fascinating. There was something almost musical about the way dozens of people worked together to create something from nothing. "When do you expect completion?" Sarah asked, adjusting her focus to capture both Robert and the framework behind him. "We're ahead of schedule, actually. Barring any major setbacks, we should have the shell complete by Christmas, with interior work finishing up by next spring. The anchor stores are already signed on. We've got a major department store, a grocery chain, and several popular restaurant franchises." As they spoke, Sarah became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere around them. The normal chatter of workers seemed to have shifted. Voices carried a different tone, though she could not make out specific words from this distance. Her years of journalism had taught her to notice these small changes, the way a crowd's energy could shift just before something significant happened. "Tell me about the safety measures you have in place," she continued, panning her camera across the work areas. "With so many workers at different levels, coordination must be crucial." Robert straightened slightly, clearly proud of their safety record. "We've got a zero-tolerance policy when it comes to safety violations. Every worker goes through extensive training before they're allowed on site. We have safety supervisors on each level, regular equipment inspections, and mandatory safety meetings every morning before work begins." Sarah lowered her camera for a moment, wiping sweat from her forehead. Even in the relatively mild morning temperature, the sun reflecting off all the metal and concrete made the construction site feel like an oven. She noticed several workers had gathered near one of the support columns, their body language suggesting some kind of discussion was taking place. "What about emergency procedures?" she asked, partly out of professional curiosity and partly because something in the back of her mind was starting to feel uneasy. "With this many people working at height, you must have detailed evacuation plans." "Absolutely," Robert replied. "We conduct monthly drills. Every worker knows the evacuation routes, assembly points, and emergency signals. We have certified first aid responders on every shift, and the local fire department conducts regular inspections of our safety equipment." The group of workers near the support column had grown larger, and now Sarah could see one of them pointing upward toward the higher levels of the structure. A supervisor in a white hard hat was walking quickly toward them, speaking into a radio as he moved. "Excuse me for just a moment," Robert said, noticing the same activity that had caught Sarah's attention. "Let me check what's going on over there." While Robert walked away to investigate, Sarah continued filming, capturing wide shots of the construction site and the surrounding neighborhood. Through her lens, she documented the contrast between the old brick buildings that had stood for decades and this symbol of urban renewal rising in their midst. The community had been divided about this project from the beginning. Some residents welcomed the jobs and shopping opportunities it would bring. Others worried about increased traffic, parking problems, and the gentrification that often followed major commercial developments. Sarah had interviewed people on both sides during the planning phases, and she understood the complexity of emotions surrounding the project. A movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. High above, on what would eventually become the fourth floor, she could see a worker gesturing emphatically to his colleagues. Even from this distance, his body language suggested urgency. Other workers had stopped what they were doing and were looking in the same direction. Sarah zoomed in with her camera, trying to get a better view of what was happening. Through the telephoto lens, she could see the worker more clearly now. He was pointing toward a section of the steel framework where several support beams came together in a complex joint. Another worker had joined him, and both men were examining something closely. The sound of Robert's voice calling her name broke her concentration. When she turned around, she saw him walking back toward her, his face serious. The supervisor in the white hard hat was with him, and both men looked concerned. "Sarah, we're going to need to pause the interview for a few minutes," Robert said. "We have a potential issue that needs immediate attention." "What kind of issue?" Sarah asked, her journalistic instincts immediately engaged. The supervisor, whose name tag read Tom Williams Site Safety, spoke up. "We've discovered some irregularities in one of the main support assemblies. It's probably nothing serious, but our policy is to evacuate the affected area until we can bring in a structural engineer to take a look." Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly. In her years of covering news, she had learned to recognize when officials were choosing their words carefully to avoid causing panic. The phrase, irregularities in one of the main support assemblies, sounded like diplomatic language for something potentially more serious. "How many workers are in the affected area?" she asked. Tom checked his clipboard. "We have 43 people working on levels 3 and 4 today, plus supervisory staff and inspection personnel. We're implementing a partial evacuation now, moving everyone from those levels down to ground level as a precautionary measure." As if to underscore his words, a series of sharp whistle blasts echoed across the construction site. Almost immediately, Sarah could see workers beginning to move toward the stairways and temporary elevators that provided access between levels. Their movements were organized but quick, suggesting that whatever drill procedures Robert had mentioned were indeed well practiced. "Is this the kind of thing that happens often?" Sarah asked, continuing to film as workers descended from the upper levels. "Safety is our top priority," Robert replied, though his answer sounded rehearsed. "When we identify any potential concern, no matter how minor, we take immediate action to ensure worker safety." Sarah watched through her camera as more workers made their way down from the elevated work areas. She counted roughly 30 people who had reached ground level so far, with more still descending. The evacuation appeared to be proceeding smoothly, with workers moving in an orderly fashion rather than rushing. Tom Williams was speaking into his radio again, coordinating with other supervisors around the site. Sarah could catch fragments of his conversation references to structural integrity, engineering assessment, and temporary work stoppage. Each phrase added another layer to her growing sense that this situation might be more significant than the officials were letting on. "Tom," she heard Robert say quietly, "how long before the engineer can get here?" "Dr. Peterson is driving in from the university. She should be here within the hour, assuming traffic cooperates." An hour, Sarah thought. That seemed like a long time to wait if this truly was just a minor precautionary measure. She made a mental note to follow up on this story, regardless of how today's interview concluded. The whistle blast sounded again, and now Sarah could see that the evacuation had expanded beyond just the third and fourth levels. Workers from the second level were also beginning to descend, and several pieces of heavy equipment had been shut down. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, keeping her camera rolling, "I think your situation might be more newsworthy than my original story about construction progress." Robert and Tom exchanged a glance that confirmed her suspicions. Whatever they had discovered in that support assembly, it was serious enough to halt work across multiple levels of a major construction project. And Sarah Martinez, who had come here expecting to file a routine community interest piece, found herself potentially in the middle of a much bigger story. The evacuation was nearly complete when Sarah first heard the sound that would later haunt her dreams. It started as a low, groaning noise, almost like the building itself was sighing. She looked up from her camera viewfinder, scanning the steel framework above them for the source of the sound. Tom Williams had gone completely still, his radio frozen halfway to his mouth. Robert Chen's face had drained of color. Around the construction site, the remaining workers who were still descending from the upper levels had stopped moving, all of them listening to the same ominous noise. "Everyone off the structure now," Tom shouted into his radio, his carefully controlled demeanor finally cracking. "Emergency evacuation. All personnel to ground level immediately." The groaning sound came again, louder this time, and Sarah could actually see movement in the steel framework. One of the main support columns appeared to be shifting slightly, causing the entire network of beams connected to it to flex in ways that steel was never meant to flex. "Sarah, we need to move back," Robert said, grabbing her arm. "Much further back." But Sarah was a journalist, and journalists did not run from breaking news stories. Instead, she raised her camera again, documenting what was happening as workers began moving much more quickly down the stairways and temporary elevators. The orderly evacuation had become urgent, though not yet panicked. "How many people are still up there?" she called to Tom. 17 on level 4, 9 on level 3, he replied, consulting his clipboard while speaking rapidly into his radio. "Rodriguez, get your crew off level 4 now. Don't worry about securing equipment. Just get everyone down." Sarah zoomed in on the workers still descending from the upper levels. Through her lens, she could see the concentration on their faces as they moved as quickly as safety allowed down the narrow stairways. These were experienced construction workers, people who understood exactly what that groaning sound meant. The steel framework groaned again, and this time there was no mistaking the movement. The entire section where the structural irregularity had been discovered was shifting visibly, causing a ripple effect throughout the connected beams and supports. "Dr. Peterson just called," Tom announced, still coordinating evacuations while talking to Robert and Sarah. "She's stuck in traffic on the interstate. Won't be here for another 40 minutes at least." 40 minutes suddenly seemed like an eternity. Sarah lowered her camera for a moment, taking in the full scope of what was unfolding before her. The massive steel skeleton that had looked so solid and permanent just minutes earlier was now visibly unstable, held together by engineering principles that were apparently failing in real time. "Is there anything we can do to stabilize it temporarily?" Robert asked Tom. Tom shook his head grimly. "Without knowing exactly what's failing and how, any intervention could make things worse. Our best option is to get everyone clear and wait for the structural engineer." A new sound joined the intermittent groaning, the sharp crack of stressed metal reaching its breaking point. Sarah spun around to see one of the cross braces on the third level snap completely in half, its broken ends swinging free in the morning air. "That's it," Tom barked into his radio. "Full site evacuation, everyone to the assembly area across the street, now." The remaining workers needed no further encouragement. Sarah watched through her camera as the last group of men descended rapidly from the fourth level, their boots clattering on the metal steps of the temporary stairway. Behind them, the steel framework continued its ominous chorus of groans and creaks. "Sarah, please," Robert said again. "We need to get to the safe zone." She was about to agree when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. At the base of the temporary stairway the workers were using, she could see that one of the support posts had shifted. The entire stairway structure was beginning to lean at an angle that would soon make descent impossible. "Tom," she called out, pointing toward the stairway, "look at the stairs." Tom followed her gaze and immediately understood the problem. The temporary stairway that 9 workers were still using to escape from the upper levels was itself becoming unstable as the main structure shifted. "Rodriguez," he shouted into his radio, "the stairway is compromised. Get your people down fast." On the third level, Sarah could see the supervisor named Rodriguez waving his crew toward the exit. But they were moving too slowly. The stairway was tilting further with each passing second, and the workers still had too far to go. That was when Sarah Martinez stopped being just a media worker and became something else entirely. She had grown up in a family of firefighters. Her father, 2 uncles, and her older brother had all served with the Los Angeles Fire Department. During her childhood, the dinner table conversation had been filled with stories of rescues, evacuations, and split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. She had never followed that path professionally, choosing journalism instead, but the training and instincts had been absorbed through years of exposure. More importantly, Sarah had spent the previous 6 months taking a technical rescue course at the local community college. It had been partially for a story she was working on about urban search and rescue operations, but also because she believed journalists should understand the worlds they covered. She had learned about rope systems, anchor points, and emergency evacuation techniques. Looking at the deteriorating situation, she realized she was probably the only person on the construction site with both the knowledge and the equipment to help those stranded workers. In her equipment bag, along with her cameras and recording devices, Sarah carried a length of dynamic rescue rope and a small assortment of climbing hardware. She had brought them today because her original plan had included filming some shots from elevated positions around the construction site. Now, that equipment might be the difference between a successful rescue and a catastrophe. "Tom," she said, pulling the rope from her bag, "I can get them down." "Absolutely not," Robert interjected. "You're not a trained rescue worker. You're not even supposed to be on the construction site during an emergency." But Tom Williams was looking at the collapsing stairway and calculating odds. He had 17 years of construction site safety experience, and he could see that conventional evacuation was no longer possible. The temporary elevator on the far side of the building might still be operational, but reaching it would require the stranded workers to traverse areas that were becoming increasingly unstable. "What kind of training do you have?" Tom asked Sarah. "6 months of technical rescue training, plus I grew up around firefighters," Sarah replied, already examining the anchor points available on the nearest stable support column. "I can set up a rappel system to get them down safely." The steel framework groaned again, and they could all see the temporary stairway lean further away from vertical. Time was running out for the workers still on the upper levels. "Do it," Tom decided, "but you follow my directions exactly. Any sign that the structure is about to collapse, we abort and get everyone clear, including you." Sarah nodded, already moving toward the support column she had identified as the most stable anchor point. Her hands worked quickly and surely, tying off her rope system with the kind of knots her firefighter relatives had taught her when she was 12 years old. Above them, Rodriguez and his crew had reached the third-level landing, but they could see that the stairway below them was no longer safe to descend. They were effectively stranded, with no way down except the rope system Sarah was rigging. "Rodriguez," Tom called up to them, "we're setting up an emergency rappel system. Stand by for instructions." Sarah tested her anchor points, applying full body weight to ensure they would hold under the stress of multiple people rappelling quickly. The rope system she was creating was basic but effective, the same type used by search and rescue teams to evacuate people from damaged buildings. "I'll go up first and help them down one by one," she told Tom, clipping her harness to the rope. "No," Tom replied firmly. "You direct from here, I'll go up." But as they spoke, the damaged section of the framework shifted again, and the temporary stairway finally collapsed completely, crashing to the ground in a tangle of twisted metal. The 9 workers on the third level were now completely cut off from conventional escape routes. And Sarah Martinez, armed with nothing but a rope, some hardware and knowledge gained from weekend rescue training, had become their only hope. With the temporary stairway collapsed in a heap of twisted metal, Sarah knew there was no time for debate. The 9 workers stranded on the third level were looking down at the wreckage that had been their escape route, and she could see the fear starting to show on their faces. Meanwhile, the steel framework continued its ominous symphony of groans and cracks, indicating that the structural failure was spreading. "Tom, I need you to clear a landing zone directly below where I'm setting up the rappel line," Sarah said, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Get everyone back at least 50 feet. If this structure comes down, we don't want anyone in the debris field." As Tom began directing the evacuation of ground personnel, Sarah looked up at Rodriguez and his crew. They were experienced construction workers, which meant they would understand rope work, but they needed clear instructions to execute the evacuation safely and quickly. "Rodriguez," she called up to them, "have any of your guys worked with rope systems before?" "3 of us have rappelling experience," Rodriguez shouted back. "Military and some rock climbing. What do you need us to do?" Perfect, Sarah thought. With 3 experienced men to help manage the others, this could work. She quickly calculated weights, rope strength, and descent rates. Her rope was rated for multiple person loads, but only if everyone followed proper procedures. "I'm sending up a harness and carabiner on the rope," Sarah called. "Put the harness on your heaviest guy first. He comes down, then I send the gear back up for the next person." Sarah attached her spare harness to the rope and began hauling it up to the third-level platform. As she worked, she became aware that more people had gathered in the area despite Tom's efforts to clear the zone. Other construction workers, site supervisors, and even some neighborhood residents had appeared, drawn by the commotion. But she also noticed something else. Several of these newcomers were not just curious bystanders. A man in a paramedic uniform was setting up a treatment area. A woman in a hard hat marked Fire Safety Inspector was coordinating with Tom Williams. A group of off-duty firefighters who had been working on a nearby project had arrived with additional rope and rescue equipment. Word of the emergency had spread, and help was arriving from multiple directions. But none of that mattered if Sarah could not get the stranded workers down before the structure collapsed entirely. Above her, Rodriguez had secured the harness on a large man named Miguel Santos, who worked as a welder on the crew. Miguel was clearly nervous about the rappelling procedure, but he trusted his supervisor and followed instructions carefully as Rodriguez helped him clip into the rope system. "Miguel," Sarah called up, "you've got this. I'm controlling the belay from down here so you can't fall. Just lean back, keep your feet wide, and walk down the wall. Don't go too fast." Miguel nodded, took a deep breath, and began his descent. Sarah managed the rope carefully, maintaining just enough tension to control his speed while allowing him to move smoothly downward. It was exactly the kind of operation she had practiced dozens of times during her rescue training, though never with a building literally falling apart around her. The steel framework chose that moment to shift again, producing a series of sharp cracks that echoed across the construction site like gunshots. Miguel instinctively grabbed for the building's framework, disrupting his rappelling position and causing him to spin slightly on the rope. "Miguel, don't grab the building," Sarah instructed firmly. "Trust the rope, keep your hands on the rope, and keep walking down." It took tremendous courage for Miguel to release his grip on what felt like solid support and trust his life to Sarah's rope system. But he did it, and 30 seconds later, he was safely on the ground, being helped out of the harness by Tom Williams and the paramedic who had arrived. Sarah immediately began hauling the empty harness back up to the third level, 8 more to go. The second man down was Carlos Reyes, one of the workers with rappelling experience. Carlos moved much more confidently than Miguel, completing his descent in less than 20 seconds. As soon as he reached the ground, he began helping Sarah manage the rope system from below, freeing her to focus entirely on coaching the remaining workers. By the time the fourth worker reached the ground, Sarah had developed a rhythm. Harness up, secure the person, talk them through the descent, control the rope, get them safely down, send the harness back up. Each complete cycle took between 1 and 2 minutes, depending on the person's experience and comfort level. But time was becoming a critical factor. The structural failure was clearly spreading through the framework. Sarah could see new stress cracks appearing in the steel beams, and the groaning sounds were becoming more frequent and more ominous. "How are we doing on time?" Sarah called to Tom, who was monitoring radio communications with emergency response teams. "Fire department ETA is 8 minutes, Tom replied. "Structural engineer is still 20 minutes out." 8 minutes for 5 more rescues. It was going to be close, but it was doable if everything went smoothly. Unfortunately, nothing about this situation had gone smoothly so far. The fifth worker, a young man named David Kim, froze halfway down the rope. Sarah could see him hanging there about 20 feet above the ground, completely paralyzed by fear. Above him, 4 workers were still waiting their turn, and time was running out. "David," Sarah called up to him, keeping her voice calm and encouraging. "You're doing great. You're more than halfway down. Just take a deep breath and keep walking." But David was not moving. Sarah could see his hands gripping the rope so tightly that his knuckles were white. He was having a full panic attack while suspended in midair on a rappelling rope. This was exactly the kind of scenario they had trained for in her rescue course. When someone freezes during a rope evacuation, you have limited options. You can try to talk them through it, you can attempt a rescue of the rescuer, or in extreme situations, you can lower them down while they remain motionless. Sarah chose a combination approach. While continuing to speak encouragingly to David, she began slowly lowering him down using the rope system. It was more difficult than a controlled rappel, requiring her to support his full weight while maintaining smooth movement, but she had practiced this technique extensively. "David, I'm lowering you down now," she told him. "You don't have to do anything except hold on. I've got you." Slowly, carefully, Sarah brought David down the remaining 20 feet to safety. As soon as his feet touched the ground, Carlos and the paramedic helped him out of the harness and moved him away from the building. 4 workers remaining, 7 minutes until the fire department arrived. Sarah was beginning to feel the physical strain of managing the rope system. Her shoulders ached from the repeated motions of hauling the harness up and controlling descents, and her hands were starting to cramp from gripping the rope. But she pushed through the discomfort, focusing entirely on the next rescue. The 6th worker came down quickly, another experienced man who understood rope work. The 7th was Rodriguez himself, who had insisted on being among the last to evacuate, ensuring all his crew members got down safely before him. 2 workers left, an older man named Frank Petrosky and a younger worker named Jason Torres. Both looked exhausted and stressed from the prolonged emergency, but they were still following instructions and staying calm. It was as Frank began his descent that Sarah heard a sound that made her heart stop. Not the familiar groaning of stressed steel, but a sharp crack followed by a rumbling noise that suggested something major had just failed in the structure above them. "Sarah," Tom shouted, "we need to get everyone clear now." But Frank was still 15 feet above the ground, moving as quickly as he dared down the rope. Jason was still on the 3rd level platform, waiting for the harness to come back up for him. Sarah looked up at the framework above them and saw what Tom had seen. A major support beam had cracked, and the entire section of the building was beginning to lean at an impossible angle. The collapse was no longer a possibility, it was imminent. And she still had 2 people to get down before the whole thing came crashing down around them. The sound of failing steel filled the air like thunder as Sarah made the most important calculation of her life. Frank Petrosky was still 10 feet above the ground, moving down the rope as quickly as his 58-year-old body could manage. Above him, Jason Torres stood alone on the 3rd level platform, waiting for a harness that might never reach him if the building collapsed first. But Sarah had noticed something that the others had missed. The structural failure was happening in a specific pattern. The main support beam that had cracked was causing the eastern section of the framework to lean away from where they were positioned. If the collapse followed the pattern she was seeing, there might be a few crucial seconds where her rope line would still be viable even as the rest of the structure came down. "Frank, you need to drop," Sarah shouted up to him. "Let go and drop the last 10 feet." It was not standard procedure. Dropping 10 feet could result in injury, but staying on the rope while the building collapsed around him would result in death. Frank Petrosky had been working construction for 34 years. He understood exactly what Sarah was asking him to do and why. Without hesitation, he released his grip on the rope and fell the remaining distance to the ground. Carlos and the paramedic caught him as he landed, cushioning his fall but unable to prevent him from hitting the ground hard. Frank cried out in pain as his left ankle twisted under him, but he was alive and clear of the collapse zone. "Frank's down," Sarah called up to Jason. "Get ready to move fast." But as she began hauling the empty harness back up to the 3rd level, Sarah realized that the rope was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The shifting of the steel framework had changed the angle of her anchor points, creating friction and drag that made it much harder to pull the harness up to Jason. Above them, more steel beams were failing in sequence. The collapse was propagating through the structure like a slow-motion avalanche, each failure adding stress to the remaining supports until they too reached their breaking points. Tom Williams was shouting into his radio, trying to coordinate the arrival of fire department rescue teams while also managing the evacuation of everyone else in the area. Sarah could hear sirens in the distance, but they were still minutes away. "Jason," she called up, "can you rappel without a harness?" It was a desperate question, but Jason Torres had grown up rock climbing in the mountains outside the city. He understood rope techniques that most construction workers never learned. "I can do a body wrap," Jason shouted back, "if you can get the rope end up to me." A body wrap rappel was an emergency technique where the rope was wound around the rappeller's body to create friction for a controlled descent. It was not as safe as using a proper harness, but it was much faster to set up, and speed was now the only thing that mattered. Sarah untied the harness from the rope and began pulling the free end back up to the 3rd level. The changing geometry of the collapsing structure was making this increasingly difficult, but she managed to get the rope end to Jason just as another major support beam failed with a sound like a cannon shot. "Wrap and go," Sarah shouted. Jason Torres had probably done body wrap rappels 100 times during his climbing adventures, but never while a building was collapsing around him. He wound the rope around his torso in the proper configuration, tested his grip, and began his descent just as the entire eastern section of the framework began to tip over. Sarah had never controlled a body wrap rappel before, but the principles were the same as managing any other rope rescue. She maintained tension to control Jason's descent speed while he walked down the increasingly unstable wall of the building. The framework was leaning so far now that Jason was actually rappelling down at an angle, with pieces of debris beginning to fall around him. Sarah could see bolts and small pieces of metal raining down from the failing joints above. "Faster, Jason," Tom Williams shouted. "The whole thing is coming down." Jason needed no encouragement. He was bounding down the wall in leaps of 4 or 5 feet at a time, trusting Sarah to control his speed and prevent him from falling free. It was probably the most dangerous rappel of his life, but it was also the fastest. With 15 feet still to go, the section of framework that held Sarah's anchor point finally began to fail. She could feel the rope system starting to shift as her anchor points moved with the collapsing steel. "Drop now," Sarah yelled to Jason. But Jason Torres was already ahead of her. Seeing the anchor points beginning to fail, he had released the rope and was falling free through the air toward the ground below. Time seemed to slow as Sarah watched Jason fall. Carlos, Tom, the paramedic, and 2 other workers all dove toward his landing point, trying to position themselves to break his fall. Jason hit the ground hard, rolling as he landed, but the men who had tried to catch him had succeeded in preventing the worst of the impact. Sarah was already running toward him, abandoning her rope system as the anchor points finally gave way completely. Behind her, the entire eastern section of the steel framework collapsed in a thunderous cascade of failing metal, crashing to the ground exactly where she had been standing just seconds before. Jason Torres was conscious but clearly in pain, holding his right shoulder as the paramedic examined him for injuries. But he was alive. Frank Petrosky was sitting up despite his injured ankle, grinning with relief and exhaustion. All 9 workers who had been stranded on the 3rd level were now safely on the ground. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her and realized that somewhere in the chaos of the last few minutes, the crowd of bystanders had grown into a small army of rescue workers. Firefighters, paramedics, police officers, and construction workers from neighboring sites had all responded to help with the evacuation. But more importantly, she realized that the total elapsed time from the moment she had started rigging her rope system to the moment Jason hit the ground had been exactly 3 minutes and 12 seconds. She knew this because Tom Williams was staring at his stopwatch with an expression of amazement. 3 minutes, Tom said, looking up at Sarah. "You got 9 people down from a collapsing building in 3 minutes." The fire department rescue teams arrived 30 seconds later, their trucks racing onto the construction site just as the last of the eastern framework crashed to the ground. The battalion chief took one look at the collapsed structure, then at the 9 rescued workers being treated by paramedics, then at Sarah Martinez standing there with rope burns on her hands and dust in her hair. "Ma'am," the battalion chief said, "I don't know who you are, but that was one hell of a piece of work." Sarah looked back at the twisted remains of what had been a 4-story steel framework just minutes earlier. The section where the 9 workers had been trapped was now completely buried under tons of collapsed metal. If they had still been up there when the final collapse occurred, none of them would have survived. "I'm just a media worker," Sarah told the battalion chief. "I came here to do a story about construction progress." But as she spoke those words, Sarah realized they were no longer entirely true. She had come here as a media worker, but she was leaving as something else entirely. The events of the last few minutes had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Tom Williams walked over to her, carrying her camera equipment which had been abandoned near the collapse zone. "Your camera kept running through the whole thing," he told her. "You've got the entire rescue on video." Sarah looked down at her camera, realizing that she had captured not just a news story, but documentation of one of the most dramatic emergency rescues ever recorded. The footage would eventually be seen by millions of people, studied by rescue training programs, and used to improve emergency response procedures at construction sites around the world. But right now, all Sarah Martinez could think about was the fact that 9 families would have their loved ones coming home safely tonight. 9 men who had been facing almost certain death were now sitting in ambulances, being treated for minor injuries instead of being loaded into hearses. And she had made that happen, not through luck or accident, but through knowledge, training, quick thinking, and the kind of courage that most people never discover they possess until the moment when someone else's life depends on it. 6 months after the Metro shopping complex collapse, Sarah Martinez found herself standing in the ballroom of the Marriott Hotel downtown, wearing a dress she had bought specifically for this occasion, and feeling more nervous than she had felt while rappelling workers down from a collapsing building. The National Association of Emergency Responders was presenting her with their Civilian Hero Award, an honor that had only been given to 12 other people in the organization's 40-year history. But as Sarah looked out at the audience of firefighters, paramedics, police officers, and emergency management professionals, she knew that the real story was not about awards or recognition. The real story was sitting at a table near the front of the room. Frank Petrosky, his ankle fully healed, had brought his 3 grandchildren to see the lady who saved Grandpa. Miguel Santos had driven down from Sacramento with his wife and twin daughters. Jason Torres, his shoulder completely recovered from his dramatic landing, was there with his parents and his girlfriend. All 9 of the workers she had rescued that day were in attendance, along with their families. But they were not the only ones whose lives had been changed by those 3 minutes on the construction site. The video footage from Sarah's camera had indeed been seen by millions of people around the world. But more importantly, it had been studied extensively by emergency response experts, leading to significant changes in how rescue operations were conducted at construction sites and other industrial locations. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health had used Sarah's footage to develop new training protocols for emergency rappelling operations. Fire departments across the country had updated their equipment requirements to include the type of lightweight rescue gear that Sarah had carried in her camera bag. Construction companies had revised their emergency evacuation procedures to account for situations where conventional escape routes might be compromised. But perhaps the most significant change had been in Sarah's own life. 3 days after the collapse, she had received a phone call from Captain Maria Rodriguez of the Los Angeles Fire Department. No relation to the Rodriguez who had been trapped on the 3rd level, but someone who had heard about Sarah's background and her performance during the emergency. "We need people like you," Captain Rodriguez had said. "People who can think under pressure, who have technical knowledge, and who understand how to communicate with the public during crisis situations." Within a month, Sarah had enrolled in the fire department's accelerated training program for career changers. 6 months later, she had graduated at the top of her class and been assigned to Station 19, one of the busiest rescue companies in the city. She still did some freelance journalism work, but now her stories focused on emergency response, disaster preparedness, and the people who dedicated their lives to helping others in crisis situations. Her unique perspective as someone who had both covered emergencies as a journalist and responded to them as a firefighter gave her insights that no other writer could provide. The footage from the construction site collapse had also attracted attention from Hollywood. 2 different production companies had approached Sarah about turning her story into a movie, but she had declined both offers. The real story, she felt, was not about one person's moment of heroism, but about how communities come together to help each other during emergencies. Instead, she had worked with the National Association of Emergency Responders to produce a documentary series about everyday heroes, ordinary people who had found themselves in extraordinary situations and chosen to act rather than flee. The series featured construction workers who had saved colleagues from equipment accidents, teachers who had evacuated schools during natural disasters, and ordinary citizens who had performed CPR, stopped bleeding, or guided people to safety during various emergencies. As Sarah stepped up to the podium to accept her award, she thought about all the people who had contributed to the successful rescue that day. Tom Williams, who had made the split-second decision to trust her judgment despite having no official authority to authorize civilian rescue operations. Carlos Reyes and the other workers who had helped manage the rope system and catch the men as they came down. The paramedics, firefighters, and police officers, who had responded immediately even though they arrived after the most critical moments had passed. "Thank you for this honor," Sarah began, looking out at the audience. "But I want to be very clear about something. What happened that day was not about one person being a hero. It was about a community responding to a crisis." She paused, making eye contact with Frank Petrosky, who was wiping tears from his eyes as his grandchildren watched their grandfather's rescuer speak. "I had some training that turned out to be useful that day. I had some equipment that happened to be the right equipment for that situation. But most importantly, I was surrounded by people who were willing to trust me, to help me, and to take risks to save the lives of others." Sarah went on to describe the changes that had resulted from the incident: the new training protocols, the updated safety equipment requirements, the revised evacuation procedures. But she also talked about the less tangible changes: the increased awareness among construction workers about emergency preparedness, the growing recognition that anyone might find themselves in a position where their actions could save lives, and the importance of building communities where people looked out for each other. "The most important lesson from that day is not that everyone needs to learn rope rescue techniques," Sarah concluded. "The most important lesson is that we all need to be prepared to help our neighbors when crisis strikes. Whether that means learning CPR, keeping first aid supplies in your car, volunteering with local emergency response organizations, or simply being the kind of person who runs toward trouble instead of away from it." After the ceremony, Sarah spent nearly 2 hours talking with the rescued workers and their families. She learned that Miguel Santos had started volunteering with a search and rescue organization in his spare time. Jason Torres had become a certified rock climbing instructor and was teaching rope rescue techniques to other construction workers. Frank Petrosky had convinced his entire construction company to upgrade their emergency equipment and training. But the conversation that affected Sarah most deeply was with Tom Williams, who had driven down from Northern California, where he was now working as a safety consultant for major construction projects throughout the region. "You know what I think about most when I remember that day?" Tom asked her. "It's not the collapse itself or even the rescue. It's the moment when you pulled that rope out of your camera bag and said you could get them down. You had no obligation to help. You could have just filmed what happened and written a story about it later, but you chose to act." Tom paused, looking around the ballroom at all the emergency responders and their families. "That's what all of these people do," he continued, gesturing toward the firefighters and paramedics. "They choose to act when they could choose to walk away. What made you special that day was not your training or your equipment. It was your decision to help when helping was dangerous." Later that evening, as Sarah drove home through the city streets, she passed the site where the Metro shopping complex collapse had occurred. The debris had long since been cleared away, and a small park now occupied the space where the steel framework had stood. A memorial plaque honored the 9 workers who had been rescued and acknowledged the dozens of emergency responders who had participated in the operation. But Sarah knew that the real memorial was not a plaque in a park. The real memorial was the changes that had been made to protect other workers in similar situations. It was the training programs that would teach future rescuers how to respond more effectively to construction site emergencies. It was the equipment that would be readily available when the next crisis occurred. And it was the simple recognition that heroes are not born. They are made in moments when ordinary people choose to help others despite the risks to themselves. Sarah Martinez had gone to a construction site that morning expecting to film a routine story about urban development. She had left as someone who understood that the most important stories are not the ones you plan to cover, but the ones that happen when you are brave enough to put down your camera and pick up a rope. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah's radio crackled to life with an emergency call. Structure fire with possible trapped occupants, 2 blocks from her location. She was officially off duty, but she was also a firefighter, and firefighters respond when people need help. Sarah Martinez turned her car around and headed toward the emergency, just as she had been doing for the past 6 months, and just as she would continue doing for as long as people needed rescuing and she had the ability to help. Because some stories never really end. They just continue one rescue at a time.